Welcome to Lazy History Club, where history is cozy, complicated, and sometimes made entirely of glass. Today we tiptoe very gently into one of the strangest royal stories Europe ever produced. A tale so delicate, so absurd, so breakable, you'd swear it came from a fairy tale. Meet King Charles of France, who ruled in the 1400s and spent much of his reign convinced he was made entirely of glass. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. So naturally, he wore reinforced clothes, refused to be touched, and feared that the wrong movement might cause him to shatter into pieces. Royal madness, sure, but also a surprisingly tender story about mental health, medieval medicine, and why you should never skip your therapy appointments, even if you wear a crown. Let's begin. Charles VI started out, well, fine-ish. Crowned King of France at age 11, fully in power by 20, he was smart, athletic, and, according to contemporary accounts, pretty decent-looking under all the velvet and ermine. But then things went sideways. At age 24, after years of stress, royal pressure, and war with England, Charles had his first major breakdown. He was riding with his men through a forest, so far, so royal, when suddenly something snapped. He turned on his own soldiers, drew his sword, started swinging. He killed one knight and injured several others before collapsing in what we now might recognize as a psychotic break. But back then, they had one explanation. Demons. Definitely demons. So how did medieval doctors treat this? Well, let's just say, psychiatry in 1400 wasn't exactly advanced. Some suggested bathing Charles in cold water. Others tried bloodletting. One even tried exercising his spleen, which was believed to house his melancholy. None of it worked. In fact, Charles's condition worsened. His episodes became more frequent. He'd forget who he was, forget he was king, sometimes forget his own children. And then came the glass. Charles began insisting, quietly at first, that he was no longer entirely human. He believed he was made of fragile glass, and that any contact, any movement, might cause him to shatter. So he ordered his tailors to sew reinforced iron rods into his clothes. He refused to be hugged, bumped, or even touched. Courtiers were instructed to walk slowly around him, bow from a distance, and never make loud noises. He once sat motionless for hours, convinced his backside would snap off if he stood too quickly. One chronicler wrote, "He feared himself to be a man most brittle, and so he became one." This wasn't a metaphor. Charles had what we now believe was glass delusion, a real and terrifying condition in medieval Europe. Believe it or not, Charles wasn't the only one. During the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, there were multiple documented cases of nobles and scholars who believed they were made of glass. Some thought their heads were glass. Others feared their feet would shatter. One man stuffed his pants with hay as shock absorption. Another refused to sit unless he had 4 pillows underneath. It was a widespread mental health phenomenon, like a medieval anxiety trend with tragic consequences. Modern historians think it may have stemmed from a growing fear of fragility in a chaotic world, literal misunderstandings of the body and soul, and elite isolation, because only rich people had the luxury of cracking up dramatically. Charles VI's condition worsened over the years. His wife, Queen Isabeau, often had to run the kingdom in his place, dealing with nobles who treated her like a temporary babysitter instead of a ruler. Meanwhile, Charles would sit in rooms alone, staring at his reflection, refused to change clothes for months, forget entire wars were happening. He became known as Charles the Mad, which is historically unfair, but also not entirely inaccurate. Despite his condition, he was still king, still signing royal decrees, still technically in charge. So France was ruled by a monarch who refused to be bumped and occasionally barked at furniture. Charles's outfits became legendary. Tailors were ordered to sew metal reinforcements into his robes, like armor, but for mental health. He wore thickly padded garments to prevent accidental breakage. Some rumors say he even wore glass slippers, which probably didn't help. One report claims he refused to sit on wooden chairs and insisted on pillows on marble benches just in case. His robes jingled with little metal clasps like a haunted wind chime, and no one dared tell him it was weird. After all, he was still king, and very, very delicate. While Charles was mentally unwell, France was in crisis. The 100 Years' War dragged on. England invaded. Factions formed around the royal court, some supporting the Queen, others trying to control the king like a royal puppet. The result? Civil war, economic disaster. And at one point, France was so divided it had two rival kings and a puppet monarch named Baby Charles. All while the real king worried about cracking his elbow on a banister. Charles lived with this condition for over 30 years. He had lucid periods, weeks or even months when he ruled normally, remembered names and joked with courtiers. But they always ended. The glass would return, the fragility, the fear, the silence. He became a symbol of instability. Foreign diplomats feared what version of the king they'd meet, Glass Charles or normal Charles. He died in 1422 after years of illness, fear, and whispers. He left behind a broken France, a fractured court, and one of the strangest medical records in royal history. So, what did we learn today? Even kings aren't immune to mental health struggles. Medieval medicine was basically, try ice water or a chicken. And if you really want people to leave you alone, tell them you're made of glass. Charles VI ruled during one of the most chaotic periods in French history. But behind the war and the politics was a man who was scared, confused, and trying not to break. Literally. Maybe the real tragedy isn't that Charles thought he was made of glass, but that no one around him understood what that meant. Thanks for watching Lazy History Club. Stay cozy, stay weird. And if someone tells you they feel fragile, maybe don't laugh, even if they're wearing iron-plated pajamas.